So welcome to the third annual PTSD Symposium sponsored by the Sticka PTSD Music and Arts Foundation. My name is Ron Sticka. I'm the executive director and founder of the foundation. The theme of our annual symposium this year is Cultural Factors and Trauma Impact. Now, we have had two prior symposia. The theme of the first one was more to look to what PTSD is. It's only been around as a defined condition since about 1980. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Some have some issues with the title or whether or not it's fully inclusive as it should be. But we looked at the meaning of PTSD, how it's defined, and how it's treated up until now. Our foundation was founded with the purpose of looking perhaps at newer and better ways to provide therapy for at least some people that are not finding satisfactory results from therapies they've been receiving. So our purpose is to present programs which appeal to mental health professionals as well as everyday people such as yourselves concerned about trauma-related mental health issues. We have a broad spectrum of people joining us today. That's the intent of our foundation. There are other symposiums around the country, which I find tend to be experts talking to experts, writing papers and delivering them. And then a lot of those papers go into a file to be preserved for anyone that wants to look. But it's not really engaging the people I think need to be brought in. I think we should look at mental health as a partnership between those who are giving service in that regard, trying to help others suffering from trauma issues, and actually thereby helping themselves, even as the mental health provider. And just to increase dialogue on better ways we can do things. So look at mental health as a partnership. It takes the participation of the person being treated to be motivated to help with the resolution of their own issues and work with any therapist and maybe a team of therapists for that purpose. So these are things each of us can do to make our collective lives better. So this symposium is designed to be in the spirit of a symposium as a collegial way, enjoying the presence of each other to also discuss issues of mutual concern from a standpoint of respect and integrity. All right, gang culture. Our panel for this one is myself. I will take lead with a little history on that. Stephen Masson will be next in order. Stephen is with us. Lieutenant Doug Mozan, I don't know if Doug is with us yet, but I may be calling on him. He's lieutenant with the Eugene Police Department, and I know they may be subject to call, so I don't know if he's been delayed in his appearance today. But we'll continue on. And Gustavo Presidente is involved with youth probation, probation services, and just general concerns with youth and youth culture. Here's a history of gang culture. We're aware of gangs being present around the United States, but in many ways, gangs are actually more of an American form of culture from the standpoint of youth gangs, and seem to be a product of immigration and the problem assimilating into new cultures into which people at various times have immigrated. And that has started with European cultures coming in, most notably Irish and Italians, but others as well. That there is a sense of being separate, a sense of not being a part of the culture to which they are joining, and therefore sort of set up a subculture with perceived threats that they need to form groups for self-protection. So if you've seen The Gangs of New York, it maybe is a little overdone historically, but that is actually, there's a lot of truth to that movie in terms of the timing of gangs as they came into being. Sort of counterculture, sort of subculture, engaging in things that are not generally regarded as legal, and a culture unto themselves, which generally are associated with hooliganism, criminals, and the like. So gangs have a negative connotation from that standpoint, although the word gang has been used for other groups, like the Gang of Eight in the Congress, for example. So a gang is a group which bands together for a common purpose, usually motivated by unfulfilled needs for security and safety, often the product of poverty and living standards in the community where the gangs are formed, associated therefore with criminality and juvenile delinquency. So there are means of survival. There's a key word in PTSD, is the need for all humans to survive in their environment, whatever it is. Gangs tend to involve control mechanisms. We'll hear from other speakers on that, rigidity in thinking. And I've seen some writings that create analogies of gangs really to feudal behavior, so that it's really not evolution, but a trip into the past to conduct themselves in those basic types of structures that come out of the feudal ages, where violence was a lot of the method of control. Most gangs involve people who have been abused, often before they enter the gang, or certainly after they enter the gang. That becomes part of the culture. There's usually an initiation. Gang members may be subjected to pain and humiliation as part of the enculturation into the gang, so that they know their proper place. So there's a lot of control, and one might even say sort of a slave environment by joining a gang, that you give up many of your rights, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Part of gang life is drug culture. There's a lot of that. There seems to be defiance of governmental authority. And in some ways, gangs operate as nations often do in war and peace decisions. So that's my quick give and take on that. We're going to talk about one gang in particular and others. One of the recent gangs originating is the Mara Salvatrucha Stoners 13, MS-13. That's been in the news a lot. I have a little experience with gangs. I was in the district attorney's office here in the late 70s into the early 80s. And one of the concerns at that time were perceived efforts of the Bloods and the Crips to expand their influence into Oregon and into our local area. That was opposed at that time. It seems to have been successful, and maybe for even non-police reasons. And the Bloods and the Crips have never had a real strong presence and seem to have gone their own ways in certain other areas. But MS-13 is one of those gangs that I was surprised to see actually originated in Los Angeles, but it's associated with El Salvadoran refugees. So that's the immigration aspect. These were people who were abused, not really accepted into the local community. They lived in poverty down in the LA area. And because they were so heavily bullied, some of the members began associating with each other as early as junior high school, middle school, into organizations that could defend themselves, and originally adopted the machete as the weapon of choice. And of course, that was only at the start of that organization. And many gangs do grow and gain influence, and soon enjoy membership as they combine with other gangs in the thousands. So that's part of the issue. Stephen, I'm going to release it now to you, because you have some actual experience having lived in those regions in California. Go ahead, Steve.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name's Stephen Masson. I grew up in poverty, so I was the perfect profile. Was put into an orphanage home at an early age, 8 years old, and my first day there, it was typical gang culture. My first day there, I was chosen to fight somebody. I said, here. So basically, they jumped me in, as the term is known. Luckily for me, this was my first fight, and I didn't know what I was doing. And the kid started swinging at me, and I accidentally hit him in the throat, and he went down, and the fight was over. So got out of that one a little bit easier. But then from there, I went on to getting involved in, after I got out of there, living with my grandmother, running with the boys on the street, got involved in petty crime, ended up in juvenile hall again, and sent back to that same orphanage again, and then eventually went to a reform school, and back onto the streets with my old running buddies again. But my salvation from all of that stuff came when it was just something, nobody helped me with it. Nobody Nobody tried to give me an alternative. I just developed a love of music and got into music. And then I also got into theater by the time high school came around. I got into theater in high school, but I wouldn't tell my buddies. It was a secret life because of course I was learning to dance and all types of other performing arts disciplines. So I was the poster boy of coming up in rough neighborhoods and finding my way out through music. And of course, through many years, even when I was young, when I was in the orphanage home, they took us to boys' clubs, rather. They're boys and girls clubs now, but back then they were boys' clubs, and they were trying to, help kids that were in situations like we were to get turned around and everything. But I didn't gravitate. I did gravitate to sports. Sports would have been okay for me, but music turned out to be my love. So between the orphanage and all of that involvement, I later on became a minister, and was in 1986 I was a volunteer minister at the California Youth Authority, and found out how the gangs had really progressed from the organic gangs that we ran around with. Everybody remembers high school. You had high school against high school, and there was some rumbles, and guys organized their cliques together to fight other guys. And so a lot of that gang stuff wasn't just coming from the poverty end of it. It was all around us. We just didn't realize where it was going. And of course, I had child PTSD and was diagnosed with military PTSD also later. So that was another lucky thing for me, was as having childhood PTSD, I wasn't trusting, and I was around, motorcycle gangs and everything, but I didn't want to be a joiner. And I believe it was my PTSD and my, the paranoia and the hypervigilance and all of the other things that go along with PTSD that kept me from that. And so I continued in my music career, went into the military, got out of the military, went into ministry, and my church that I pastored many years ago in Stockton, California. Stockton, California was a dumping ground for both prisons and California youth authorities. So many of my parishioners' children were involved in gangs, and I had to get up to speed on learning how to relate to these young people and get them another alternative. Of course, we try to get them into the church activities, but they don't always gravitate towards that. So we needed to really get out of the box, and that's when I began getting young people involved in music, and helping to mentor them in music. And so I realized we just have to find alternative activities and groups to get these kids into positive culture. Like sports have been used for decades, and poverty plays a major role. So whether it's sports, performing arts, today chess is a big thing. Clubs. The key to getting kids out of gangs, though, for whatever alternative you want to offer them, is outreach. Okay. And remembering my situation, if someone would have come to me when I was in these orphanages or the juvenile halls or the reform schools, and tried to find out what I would be interested in, perhaps I wouldn't have gone so far, because by the time I was in high school, I had already been in 40 or 50 fistfights. I probably already had traumatic brain injury before I even went into the military. So I I believe that's the key is outreach, getting to the kids as soon as we can. Now, the problem there is it's mostly volunteer groups, people who do it in their spare time that are doing most of the volunteer outreach to it. And instead of, paying probation officers and other modalities that we see in trying to reach children when we find them in those places is probably not working as well as it should. So getting to them while they're in there and finding a new way to perhaps now I've just become a certified peer support specialist that I'm using in my work with veterans with PTSD, and that's a possible alternative is to get peer support specialists trained for these young kids. In other words, they want youth peer support. There's a big, I see the advertising all the time right now for jobs for young people who are in their young 20s and stuff coming out of college that can be peer support specialists for these kids in trouble. And I think that's a way that we can explore and go further and see if we can if we can get a paid core of workers out there that can devote their full time to it is going to be key to that issue.
Stephen, I think that's a good segue. Let's go to Gustavo Presidente, who is involved. He's the head of youth services and probation services for youth in Lane County. So, Gustavo.
Hey, thanks, Ron, and thanks, Steve. I really appreciated that perspective. I wish I was the head of youth services over here, Ron. I'm the probation supervisor. Just to clear it up, because I know it's going on YouTube. So, my name is Gustavo Presidente. Like I mentioned, am the probation supervisor for Lane County Youth Services. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me.
You're okay. If you can turn up your sound just a little bit, but you're fine.
Okay. So, I supervise the probation department. I was a juvenile probation officer prior to that, but primarily I spent a lot of time focusing on mental health work. I was a mental health therapist for about 5 years, specifically working with at-risk youth, adults and juveniles who had committed sexual offenses or other violent offenses, and ultimately worked up to the juvenile system and made a career change. Prior to that, I worked a lot with the homeless community here in Lane County, particularly families, and also child welfare families who were either at risk of losing their children or were going to, there was going to be a removal. They would send therapeutic people in to aid in that process.
Gustavo, did your background steer you in this direction for mental health services? You're from El Salvador, right?
Well, yeah. So my interestingly enough, my parents and my younger brother, who's a year younger than I am, they're all from El Salvador. I'm the only person that was in my family that was born here. And so it's definitely given me an opportunity and a positionality that my younger brother, who's also in the military, he hasn't had, right? And so and I grew up in LA. So we went back and forth a lot. Grew up in LA around the 90s, and I think Steve touched on this a little bit. The gang culture at that time had really blown up to the point where if you weren't a part of it, you weren't a part of it. It was definitely glorified in the media. And a big part of the identity of Black and Hispanic youth who were searching for an identity amidst all of the chaoses of the world. Ron touched on poverty a little bit, right? Just one of the factors that I and others were dealing with. So I ended up getting my master's degree in social work, and so here I am. And so what I hope to talk about today, and I know we don't have too much time, is to make a connection between juvenile delinquency, some of the gang behavior, and its link and its intersectionality to mental health. because I think both are oftentimes misunderstood. And if you don't mind, I might have to move my screen because I had some notes. So let's see. How do we do this? Okay. So just to give you an overview, I want to talk about social adaptation and the use of the term gangs and mental health, juvenile behavior and mental health, gang motivators, and then what to do next. Okay, so I took a look at various different definitions of mental health, and as you all can tell, there are many out there, but they have some similar patterns. I'll just read a couple of them to you. Mental health is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stressors of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make contribution to his or her community. That's from the World Health Organization. The mentalhealth.gov views mental health as an emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Part of the reason why I wanted to bring that up, and there's many definitions around this, but they have some similar patterns. The idea is that there are other factors that are affecting somebody's ability to live a healthy life, right? So I think that's an important concept when we're talking about juvenile delinquency, and also youth involved in gangs. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So some common mental health symptoms include biological factors such as gender and brain chemistry, life experiences or trauma and or abuse, family and or mental health problems, poverty, having too low of energy, feeling numb, having unexplained aches and pains, anger, feeling of helplessness or hopelessness. I mean, the list goes on and on. So these are factors that are attributed to somebody that has a mental health challenge. My hope is to be able to have you all see that is also those are also some factors that affect youth that are involved in gangs. So there are many definitions for the term gang, and I think that's important to note. The federal definition means that there's an association of 3 or more individuals whose members collectively identify themselves by adopting a group identity which they use to create an atmosphere of fear or intimidation, frequently by employing one or more of the following: a common name, slogan, identifying sign, symbol. I think you guys get the point, right? So part of what I'm trying to say is that mental health has a definition that is rooted out of an understanding that is very different than what we're seeing for gangs, which later I'll talk about has some pretty significant implications. A state definition is pretty similar. I'm not going to go too much into that. But there's also let's see. So some of the effects that juvenile behavior and mental health, some of the effects that you can see are that there's poor emotional and mental well-being. There's trauma and exposure, social pressures, social isolation, anxiety, fear, anger, or depression. These are things that I think we could all agree are pretty common in the mental health world, but are not seen as such. And I think a part of that big reason has to do with the way that we've viewed and internalized some of these groups of individual, particularly youth. I believe the term gang was first coined in a I don't know if it was a federal document or a state document in California, where they were essentially trying to do what they did with the RICO Act, right? Try to get a group of people who were a part of a crime and find some legal basis for charging them for what they were doing. But I think that has caused some challenges. You know, even the building that we have here, it was built in 1994. It's a relatively new building, and we haven't used half of it because it is built off of the idea that youth are super predators and that youth, are going to harm. And so what that's done is created this difficult sense of difficult ability to be able to connect with kids on the probation level, because as soon as they come in here, they're wanting to. There's a gap that we have to overcome as human beings.
Gustavo, is there a path that we should be pursuing to try to extricate our youth from gangs, or to even prevent them from getting the interest to go into a gang in the first place? Do you have any ideas of activities we should be looking at as a community?
Yeah, I do. I mean, and I think the most important thing that you said is, as a community, so many times we're fragmented in the types of services that we deliver. And I think somebody mentioned, either you or Steve, that volunteering and mentoring and doing these things are super, super important. But if we don't have a collective understanding as a community, because in many ways this is a community problem, you remove the kid from the gang, the community is still part of that same dynamic and system. You bring that kid back, and the likelihood is that the youth will go back to that. So I definitely think I think all approaches should be tried, to be quite honest with you. And I don't say that lightly. That isn't without much thought, because we are all individuals with different, perspectives, and some of us may like music, others may like sports. I think the important thing is, one, to be able to humanize the person who is quote unquote involved in a gang. And once we can do that, then we can begin the process of connecting with them in whichever way we see fit as individuals.
Thank you, Gustavo. And I have one question from your perspective. How extensive is the problem here? And gangs, as part of what I was defining, it tends to generate into organized crime activity if left unchecked. So
right.
Preventive is obviously the best way, but what can we do as a community, and how serious is the problem in our local community right now?
Great question. So, interestingly enough, and I may be a little biased here because I am from LA. And so my experience of gangs and here in Lane County is very different. So what we see is a lot of, not a lot of, but let's say last year there were about 5 groups of organized kids throughout the year that we would, one could say would classify as a gang. But these are kids that are ranging anywhere from 8 years old, all the way to like 14. And by that time, they're involved in the system and on a path towards wherever they're going to go. So some of the names that were thrown out there, just to give you an idea, were the Scooter Gang and the Apartments. And they flip-flopped between whether they were Crips and Bloods throughout the year. And so, these are things that, historically, with our gang understanding here in the United States, are big no-nos. Right, that kids are doing here. So to some extent, it's wanting to join. But as far as it being a problem where it's a significant one, I think the adult world is one where here in Lane County where that is a little bit higher. I mean, there was a recent drug bust from people bringing up drugs from Mexico. So I think that is much more sophisticated than the types of gangs that we're seeing here, as compared to the sophistication that you see in places like Chicago and LA, who have people guiding them on how to be gang members.
Can you say just a word on tagging and gang signs and things like that, and how aware we should be of what those mean?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it's really important to understand the various forms of outputs that gang members have, and like you said, part of it is tagging. Tagging is one of those things that has been deeply criminalized, and it was especially in LA. You couldn't buy a can of spray paint without having an adult, right? And so there's various reasons for that, especially in a place like that. But when I came to Eugene, there was a place over by the railroad station. Forgive me if that's not what it's called. I haven't been on a train in a while. And there was a place where you could tag. And so what a very different approach. And I know they have this in Venice. And I mean, that form of expression is something that can be extremely beautiful. The problem is when you have such destabilization in a region as big as, let's say, Los Angeles or Chicago, with such historical poverty and pain, that tends to come out in in unhealthy ways, to where tagging could be is typically something that you can get in a lot of trouble with, right? You cross somebody's name out, you tag in their territory, and all of a sudden, you know, they're looking to fight you. In fact, my seventh grade girlfriend, seventh grade girlfriend was going to stab another girl because they both tagged the same name and went to a different school.
So it's significant and can be dangerous. Is that basically it? And it's territorial usually.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to have to move on. Give you one last word, Gustavo, if you have any idea what may work best. Is it the mentoring, music, or athletics, or all of the above?
Yeah, I think all of the above is an extremely important one to consider. We can't just do it with just one approach.